Everybody, welcome to the Association of Certified eDiscovery Specialists webinar channel and the ACEDS webinar on Bridging Legacy Data, Defensible Disposition, and AI-Driven Insights. I am not Mike Quartararo, president of ACEDS, who is taking some much-deserved time off this week. I am Doug Austin, editor of eDiscovery Today, who will be moderating today's webinar. Over the next hour, in the first part of a two-part webinar, we'll discuss how organizations can bridge the gap between legacy data, defensible eDiscovery practices, and AI-driven insights using an actual case study to illustrate how it can be done. Before we begin, please note that we do welcome questions, which you can submit in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. We also have a chat tab where you can feel free to chat amongst yourselves and amongst us, as we'll see the chat messages. And also should note that a copy of the slides is available as well via the Resources tab at the bottom of the screen. We've got a terrific panel today here to discuss these topics, so let me start by introducing them. Adam Rouse is the Director and Senior Counsel, eDiscovery Operations for Walgreens Company. Adam advises internal and external counsel concerning eDiscovery and legal hold issues across a wide variety of commercial, regulatory, and employment matters. Additionally, Adam coordinates with the global compliance team to facilitate data collection and analysis for global compliance efforts and drives the adoption of new and emerging legal technology within the legal department. Adam also teaches eDiscovery and advanced problem solving as adjunct faculty at Loyola University, Chicago Law School. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you.
Brendan Sullivan is the CEO at S2 Data. Brendan has an extensive history in data storage and retrieval spanning over 30 years and has been leading companies in the space for over 20 years. He often speaks on topics related to legacy data remediation, defensible deletion, the use of backup tape and discovery, and retirement of legacy backup environments. His current focus at S2 Data is on helping clients reduce risk and exposure resulting from their backup environments, speeding up time to data, and lowering total cost of ownership for all data. Hello, Brendan.
Hello.
And John Goff is a managing director within FTI's Technologies Information Governance, Privacy, and Security practice and is based in Atlanta. John has 28 years of IT experience, 18 of those specific to the legal technology arena. His focus at FTI has been working with global clients to implement information governance, eDiscovery, and records management programs with a big focus on helping clients tackle data governance challenges, such as identifying, managing, and defensibly disposing of information. Hi, John.
Hi, Doug.
All right, and I'm Doug Austin, who will be your data remediation and eDiscovery point guard for this webinar. I'm the editor of eDiscovery Today, which is a daily blog about eDiscovery, cybersecurity, data privacy, information governance, and AI trends, best practices, and case law. I've been providing consulting and project management services in the legal space for over 30 years, so I know a thing or two because I've seen a thing or two. And I've been daily blogging for nearly 15 years, so I'm either committed or I ought to be. And here's what we'll be talking about today. We'll begin by talking about why legacy data matters, including how prevalent it is, the risk it creates, and the impacts it can cause for your organization. Brendan and John will then discuss the aforementioned case study, which is a restoration and remediation project for a lot of legacy email data. They'll talk about the challenges, the process used for addressing those challenges, and the outcome for the client. Then Adam will discuss these topics from the perspective of Discovery Counsel, including best practices, what Sun data is, how it differs from ROT data, and what the Legal Data Intelligence Initiative is. And finally, we'll leave you with a brief preview of part 2 of this webinar series, where we'll discuss leveraging AI models on Sun data. And of course, we'll look to save time for questions at the end, but we'll also address them along the way if we can. Of course, any ideas expressed by us here today are our own, not those of our organizations, clients, or partners. When it comes to disclaimers, there's no such thing as defensible disposition. So let's start our discussion by talking about why legacy data matters. I think most of you probably know that legacy data is not a good thing, but how prevalent is it? What types of risks are associated with it? And what impacts could it have on your business? I'm a stats guy, so let's start with some stats that illustrate just how prevalent it is. We provided a link to each of them so you can confirm that they weren't hallucinated by ChatGPT. The first stat is that organizations allocate as much as 60 to 80% of their IT budgets to maintain older systems. So as you can imagine, spending that much time on older systems limits resources available for innovation and modernization efforts toward newer systems. Another stat is that IBM estimates that 70% of collected data remains unused by businesses, and much of that data is often due to its storage in legacy formats or systems that are difficult to access or analyze. So what are the risks associated with legacy data? They include things like sensitive data being more vulnerable, challenges in meeting compliance obligations, inefficiencies in your operations, and the greater potential of data silos. That can lead to significant negative impacts to your business, including financial costs and innovation stagnation, potentially putting your business at a competitive disadvantage. So Brendan, you've helped a lot of clients over the years with legacy data remediation and retirement of legacy backup environments. So what are the biggest driving factors you've seen from clients in deciding to address their legacy data challenges?
The biggest two that we see on a regular basis are fairly obviously risk and cost. The risk is that there's data that you don't necessarily, or the client doesn't necessarily want to have, or is a problem, is on a legal hold platform, or is likely to be, or is possibly going to be. So that's kind of the number one driver, and that's normally the trigger for actually doing something about it. The other driver are costs. The costs are almost always significantly larger than clients expect. And there's a lot of hidden costs. There's storage costs. There's cost to maintain the legacy environments from a hardware perspective, the licensing costs for software that manages and pushes the data. And then there's other IT resource costs, people, air conditioning costs, utility type costs. Those are the drivers, and they creep up. And I think largely companies have historically not tackled the legacy data challenges that they have for a long period of time. We did a project fairly recently from a Canadian bank, and we completed it in 2023, and we first quoted it in 2008 when Sean and I were at previous companies. So it's the same thing. So 15 years of storage cost for the quantity of tapes that we tackled, by our estimation, was well in excess of $3 million just for the tape storage costs. So it's these costs add up, but they're never normally the trigger. The trigger is normally the legal issues. Legal and compliance issues, that's normally the trigger.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly that's important. And I mean, 15 years, that's crazy to have that long a period of time storing that data unnecessarily. I am noting in the chat that people are having difficulty downloading the slides. I noticed Chrissy put something in the chat to have people ask for the slides. I'll also mention that after the webinar, we plan to send out an email with a link to the recording and the slides. So you'll get them one way or another, I promise. So apologies for the difficulties in downloading them. So John, a lot of organizations continue to maintain legacy systems because they want to avoid the costs of replacing those systems or remediating that data. So what are the risks of not doing so, especially in terms of potential exposure of sensitive data?
Yeah, there's a few that come to mind. One that you have listed here, and that's the potential for increased security vulnerabilities due to using legacy systems. You end up with unpatched software, at times outdated security features, weak encryption. Sometimes there's no encryption. Legacy systems may make it hard to meet data privacy regulations as well, some that require specific security measures or data handling practices. We've had some clients that have done a defensible disposition project or gotten off of legacy hardware and software because of this reason in particular. And then a large volume of legacy systems and data greatly complicates the implementation of legal holds and makes the management of data retention extremely difficult, increasing the amount of data potentially exposed during a security breach. And then if you look outside of the potential exposure of sensitive data, there's a couple of items that I see as drivers too, which is the increased risk of hardware failure, making needed data inaccessible and you unable to respond to eDiscovery or regulatory requests in a timely manner. In a previous life, I've actually experienced this twice when I had my in-house positions. And then significantly increased eDiscovery costs from potentially holding on to data indefinitely.
Yeah, well, and speaking as somebody who has been responsible for eDiscovery for a few clients, yeah, that's a nightmare when you can't get to that data for sure. Yep. So Adam, could you discuss how legacy data contributes to the problem of data silos in organizations and the problems that causes for those organizations?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things we see with legacy data that certainly doesn't help the situation is ownership ambiguity. So we see where no one wants to really own or take responsibility for those data silos, or just even locating someone or even a department, even if it's not a specific person, to take responsibility for the data can be very difficult. We see that a lot with like legacy SharePoint sites, where an owner of the site may have built out this wonderful site and then left the company, and then it just becomes an ownerless site and a bunch of data that sits out there. And that really leads to a couple problems with siloed data. I think the most major of which is just operational inefficiency, right? You waste so much time trying to find what you're looking for or figure out where the necessary data is to do your project or your job or whatever, even besides increased eDiscovery and legal hold costs, which are certainly a huge problem too. But just operating the business when the data is siloed just becomes a huge problem. It also leads to poor information governance. It's difficult to apply proper retention policies if you don't know where your data is. And then I think, the one thing we haven't talked about quite yet on this is just it really leads to impaired decision making. It's very difficult to make good data-driven decisions when you don't have access to your complete data set, or even understand where that data may sit. It's hard to think strategically about legacy data when it's just scattered all over the place and in these different silos. And then I think the final kind of point I want to put on this is just from a technology standpoint. Older systems don't always talk very well to newer systems. And so it's difficult to, you may not be able to integrate these older legacy data systems into your automated legal hold process, or collecting from it for eDiscovery just becomes a nightmare. And as John mentioned, that just drives costs through the roof when you need to find a specialist or a forensics firm or someone to come out and say, here's what we have. We don't even know if we have responsive data here, but we need to look. And then it just, kind of spirals downhill from there.
Yeah, absolutely. And that the challenges of incorporating legacy data into automated legal hold and into preservation practices certainly is one of the things that keeps eDiscovery people up at night for sure. And is probably a great segue into our case study, where we'll talk about how to illustrate the legacy data problem in organizations. So John, S2 Data and FTI Consulting recently worked on this large legacy email data restoration and remediation project for a client. So could you provide the background of the project, what the client wanted to accomplish, and what were the deadlines that were driving project completion?
Sure. So this client was transitioning from on-premise MS Exchange and Enterprise Vault hosted in 3 locations globally with a third-party vendor to M365 and an alternate compliance archive. At the conclusion of the migration, which was roughly 12 months, they were exiting the vendor. So there was no lag in between the time the migration happened and the time they were exiting, there was no buffer to allow extra time to do any eDiscovery work or preservation. The client had suspended expiry of backups to ensure legacy employee mailboxes on legal hold were preserved, and the vendor's estimate for producing the required mailboxes natively using their existing eDiscovery process was 3+ years. This would have forced an incredibly expensive multi-year renewal of services. So we were tasked with identifying and extracting all required custodian data exclusive to backups before their third-party agreement expired and these systems were shut down. And that task was given to us with a couple of speed bumps or hurdles that we had to kind of figure out. One was the backup environment was disk-based EMC data domain, not environment at the third centers. These were also live systems. So the challenge became, how do we execute a plan that does not interrupt day-to-day business operations for remote and on-site employees, as well as the client's planned exit from the vendor? And finally, there was also the question of where the recovered data would reside going forward for eDiscovery purposes. So we had to develop a solution and workflows to help eDiscovery store, inventory, and track the preserved data as part of their daily operations once it was collected.
Yeah, and obviously, I mean, we look at that final paragraph. I mean, you're dealing with 90,000 mailboxes here, so that's just like a huge undertaking, and clearly, a very challenging project. So thanks, John. Now let's, John's kind of set a little bit of the stage of some of the challenges, but let's get into some of the specific challenges associated with this project. So Brendan, could you talk about the problems that the sunsetting of the Dell EMC infrastructure caused for the client, and talk a little bit more about why it was so important to move that data off that platform?
Sure. So as John mentioned, this data resided from 3 different third-party IT data centers, 3 different continents with 3 different overriding presiding privacy type rules and regulations about what you can do with the data, and that provided all of the complexity that anyone could wish for. So I think to compound it, the data domains were all they'd all been unplugged, and so consequently, as a result of being unplugged, the CMOS battery systems within those devices had all died, which meant that you couldn't start the systems up. And when you're entertaining a project like this, there's always a proof of concept element where you've got to be able to prove that you can do it. And because of that, I would just kind of preface that to say that these projects cannot be tackled natively. They just can't with any kind of timeline or cost basis. They cannot be tackled natively. And what I mean by natively is if you're creating a backup for data, you've got the system, you've got the software, you've got the hardware resources, the people, the data, and you have 2 choices really. One is to rebuild that environment, and the other is to trick the data into thinking it is in that environment, and then be able to apply various different technologies to be able to interrogate it, catalog it, find files, extract, etc., etc., etc. The problem is that with native environments is that they are backup and restore. And you can think of it like a house with a front door and the back door, and people can walk into that house on a steady basis, and gradually the house fills. And when it comes to emptying the house, you can open the back door and they can walk out. But because there's 7, 8, 9 years of walking into that house, the house is full, and the doors are only a certain size. You can't get any more in, you can't get any more out. And what we focus on is the restoration, the extraction, and the native systems that could produce data for whatever reason. They simply cannot go fast enough. And software companies might not have a motivation on providing enough licenses, at low cost to be able to do it. So the only way you can tackle this really with any kind of efficiency is non-natively. And what we do to enhance the analogy, so to speak, is we take the roof off and we just take all the contents out in one go, and we use our technology to be able to go as fast and wide as possible, because fast and wide is the least risk to the client. Now, with that, there's also the proof of concept, as I mentioned. Who would invite anybody to go to Europe and tackle a legacy data remediation if they can't prove that they've done it? And so to prove that you're able to do something like this with a non-native technology in a fast and efficient manner, you either have to take a lot of your technology and your people to the far corners of the earth, or you create a solution and then move that solution. And where we were a little lucky with this project was that a portion of the data did reside in the US. So we were able to create a proof of concept in the US. And then once we got that technology perfected, we took that technology to Europe. So that was kind of challenge number one. The other challenge for this particular project was that it was post-COVID, about a year after the real peak of the COVID period, but there was still a lot of restrictions and challenges with doing that. And we landed in Singapore with the team, and the objective was to take that data from Singapore and take it to Europe, where the data could be processed. And we got in Singapore, and the quarantine measures in Singapore were different than in Europe for people. So I had people hanging around for a period of time. That was a challenge. And of course, what we'd done is we'd reserved a cargo jet, to actually move the data domains with our people to Europe. But because of the quarantine issues that changed when we got there, we lost the cargo jet. So in the end, we leased a Boeing 737 passenger jet, managed to get one of those, and got the data to the cage in Europe. So it was, outside of the technical side, there was a lot of logistical challenges with this, and you've just got to find a solution.
Yeah, and yeah, I obviously I've read the case study, but I didn't realize the timing of it and the fact that the pandemic had an impact in what you all were having to do. So that had to be pretty wild. Anything else from the standpoint of the global nature of it that really kind of caused challenges? Because I know you say you started in the U.S. and then worked your way across. Anything else that stood out as challenging about the global nature of the data?
The stakeholders involved, data that had privacy regulations in APAC, data that had privacy regulations in Europe, and so with all of that required that a broad range of stakeholders, not just geographically, but within the legal people, the compliance regulatory people, the IT staff, and of course understanding what's required to be able to get access and verify what you're doing was extremely difficult. And so things like naming conventions within email domains, is it John, is it Johnny, is it Jonathan, is it James, et cetera, et cetera. So, the proof and the verification that the target custodians that were required to be retained were exactly who they were, and the way that they were backed up didn't always make that the easiest thing to obtain. That was a challenge. And then, of course, you've always got the risk of new matters. When you're talking about a global company that has multiple legal holds and multiple matters at any given time, they can be within a period of 12 months, as John mentioned, the project was scheduled to take. Any new thing can happen, and that new thing can happen can spoil the population of what you're doing. So the challenge of actually adhering to existing active and potential matters while we're actually tackling the large scale remediation was particularly challenging.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll imagine. Yeah, I mean, you had the volume, you had a lot of other considerations there. So very interesting, unique kind of challenges there. So, so from a custodian standpoint, John, were there any unique challenges in identifying the required custodians and data to restore from backup for the project?
Yeah, so kind of tailing into something that Brendan had mentioned, there was a standard, supposedly standard Navy convention for mailboxes, but it was a very loosely followed. So what it ended up being is it was standard-ish, and so there was a challenge, and we had to work with the client to help identify mailboxes and make sure that we had the right custodians identified, as because at times the mailbox names differed from what it should have been, which is usually the Active Directory ID, for instance. And then the next challenge became identification for custodians who lived in or worked in multiple jurisdictions over their employment period, and ensuring we had the correct mailbox or mailboxes identified for preservation. And then on top of that, we then had to identify the specific backups to target for these mailboxes within the required periods of interest, and then work with the client to develop a process for the storage, management, and identification of the data going forward.
Yeah, and I mean, I imagine, a project like this is probably a combination of a lot of person power and a lot of technology, right? I mean, that seems like that would be, it's kind of one of those unique things where you kind of have to figure it out in some aspects as you go, right? Brendan and John?
Yeah, and a lot of double and triple and quadruple checking, because with that many custodians spread globally, you can also run into the situation where people have common names. There was a period of time where there were maybe not unique employee IDs assigned to users. So is the John Goff in Europe the same as the John Goff in America? How do we handle this? Which is the right custodian, and what jurisdictions did they live in throughout their career? So it became a bit of a process to kind of narrow that down and settle on who needed to be collected, just to make sure that everything was correct.
Yeah, no doubt about that. I can imagine. So, of course, we wouldn't be here if there weren't a solution to these challenges. We wouldn't have anything to talk about. So, Brendan and John, having discussed the challenges you were faced with, and there were a lot of them, could the two of you walk through the process of completing the project for the client and what the outcome and benefits were for the client? And I know that's on the second slide, so just next slide. So just let me know when you want me to advance.
So I can start with the data requests, and then Brendan, if you want to pick it up from there. But we worked with the client to develop a custom solution that would generate data requests. We would then submit to S2 for the required backups to target and the specific mailboxes on those backups to restore. What made this difficult was that, and I think Brendan probably alluded to this earlier, was that the backup inventories provided by the vendor didn't necessarily reflect what was available in the data domain. So we had to work with the client to identify alternate backups that could be used if the primary wasn't available. And then as part of that process, we had to standardize the packaging of data. So they would know, so Brendan's team would know how to package naming conventions for tracking purposes, how the information was going to be delivered to the client, chain of custody reporting that had to be generated to include hashing of data, and then organization of the information within their regional eDiscovery repositories and updates to their custodian and data tracking solution. So when data started flowing, we had the proper intake process going to store and track the information. And then we had to implement a process to QA each batch as it was received from S2 to ensure all requested data was delivered, all reportings reconciled, are there any exceptions that need to be addressed, things like that.
All right. Brendan, can you talk a little bit about S2's role in this?
Sure. From a technology perspective, I mentioned that there was a proof of concept period. I think we took about 6 weeks to perfect the process in the US on local data domains before we actually went to APAC and Europe. So many of you listening will know our historical expertise, so to speak, of backup tape. There was no backup tapes here. There was 0 tapes in this whole project. There were a lot of backups, but there were no backup tapes. And so historically, the technology that we would use is to kind of trick the storage repository, historically tapes, but in this case, data domain, into thinking that it was the original environment where the data was created. And this particular backup environment was Networker, which is the old Legato Networker that became EMC Dell Domains Networker platform that backed up data domain instances, and then that contained Microsoft Exchange Exchange information systems. So the proof of concept piece was engineered to actually use existing code but modify it so that we could talk to the data domain. Remember, I said, like take the roof off, talk to the whole thing in one go. And the key is to be able to scan wide and touch only what you want, because the native softwares often will, they'll have routines. They're expecting certain portions of backup sessions and first get this session, then get that session to actually create a restoration and extraction. And that can be extremely slow and extremely cumbersome. So the technology required identification of all catalogs, file lists, and then audit trails, of course, extensive audit trails to prove to defensively state exactly what we look for, what we found. And then once we got that confirmation that John talked about with regards to the custodian identification, then it was the extraction piece. And then, once it gets to the exchange side, candidly, that's the easy bit. So, it gets to the PSD extraction, or the creation of a PSD, a target cumulative custodian PSD that gets created, and then that would go to the encrypted disk and sent back to the client.
All right. And so then really from that, oh, go ahead, John.
I was going to say,
Sorry,
it should also be noted that there wasn't just Exchange backups in this data domain. There were other backups. There was Enterprise Vault backup. So it really was an exercise to make sure, as Brendan said, kind of look wide and just be able to target very quickly what was needed.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and so then really, I guess, once you got past that point of really getting that data into a format you could use, you could work with it. Any, when I'm looking at like stage 3 there and custodian level deduplication, responsive filtering, any difference, in kind of a normal project once it was a lot of the hard work really in stages 1 and 2, or or were there some differences, some different aspects to stage 3 there with the dedupe and filtering?
Yeah. That's the straightforward side from my perspective. To me, the complex side was all of the stuff that John dealt with all of multi stakeholders and demands over chops and changes in the project. But from the technology perspective, the dedupe and filtering is fairly vanilla stuff.
Okay. Great.
Yeah. The only thing is on the back end. So if you remember, for eDiscovery purpose, they had suspended backups indefinitely within the Exchange environment. So what happened is they were used to going to that for eDiscovery. So whenever a request came in, that was their go-to. So we had to work with the team that once the data was collected and saved in their eDiscovery store to update their legal hold management system to say, hey, now if I want Brendan's email and I want his mailbox information for this time period, I have to go somewhere else and make sure that exists. So because obviously the system they're used to going to no longer exists at that point.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. All right, so let's really look at what the outcome and the benefits were. You guys want to talk a little bit about that in terms of this project?
Yeah. Do you want to hit that?
Yeah. I'll start it. You can chime in. So timely email. So we successfully did this by taking ownership of the hardware and doing this exercise outside of the vendor. It allowed the client to exit the vendor on time because we weren't affecting daily operations. This wasn't located in their data center and had no bearing on when they exited the vendor within each jurisdiction. Cost reduction and risk mitigation. They exited the vendor. They didn't have to sign a multi-year agreement like they would have had to if the vendor had done this. No more costs on keeping that data center and the risks of the legacy hardware up and running. And to Brendan's point, if it had failed or they needed to do something with it, the batteries in the CMOS were dead. They couldn't even got it up and running if they wanted to. And then what it ended up happening is it eliminated the need for MS Exchange and networker licensing, as well as the support and maintenance that goes along with all of these things. So when you look at the savings, the risk, and everything else, the client ended up having just tens of millions of dollars in savings. If you think about the cost to hire a third party, all the data centers, all the software, and everything else over time.
Yeah, yeah, and obviously, compliance assurance, making sure
Yeah.
be able to meet legal regulatory requirements, a lot of big advantages, both monetarily and risk-wise for an organization. Very, very interesting, very fascinating project. Thanks for talking about it and sharing that info. Now let's get kind of an eDiscovery Counsel perspective on the issue of legacy data, and we'll turn to Adam. So, Adam, from that Discovery Counsel perspective, what are the legal risks associated with unmanaged legacy data and what we call ROT, redundant, obsolete, and trivial data?
Yeah, I mean, the first one is probably not a straight legal risk, but it is a financial risk to the company. And that is just your litigation costs will increase exponentially based on how much legacy and silo data you have out there. We talked about it and kind of previewed it a little bit earlier in the webinar, but it's a situation where if you don't know what you have or you don't know where it's located, it becomes very difficult to preserve and then ultimately collect and review that data, which then leads, directly into spoliation risks. It tends to lend itself, if you have a bunch of rot data out there, get yourself into a situation where you don't have the ability to effectively preserve relevant data, and it becomes a problem if you have to go back and really explain to the opposing party, to the court, to the government, whoever you're dealing with, why you have a patchwork of data, or why you have some data about the subject but not others, because you either can't find it, it wasn't cataloged, or maybe it just was on a legacy system and died and no one knew about it. I think, the other thing, and John alluded to this earlier, is there are data breach and privacy concerns too. The more data you collect in these legacy systems, the more of a treasure trove you can find, threat actors can find if they manage to breach your environment. And plus, when you talk about modernizing security controls, it's not always possible on these legacy systems. So you may have systems that just don't meet today's necessary security standards because they can't. They're old, they're not supported anymore. No one's writing security patching for them. So vulnerabilities are they're out there, and you have to do your best to mitigate or manage them. We did talk and specifically in the case study about regulatory compliance. That's another huge one. If you are a highly regulated industry, banking, pharmaceuticals, any of the industries that deal with a lot of the three-letter agencies in Washington, you oftentimes have very specific retention requirements, and that's also you have very specific requirements on how long you can keep data legally. So that's an issue too. And what's really compounding that now is with the CCPA and the other state privacy guidelines. You now have, for every state that passes their own privacy laws, you run a risk if you have people's personal information, if that's the nature of your business. Certainly with us, it would be retail purchases, prescribing records, all those sorts of things have a lot of personal information in them. If you keep that too long, you run afoul of these new regulations, and that can be just not a great situation for any organization to be in. And then I think,
Sorry, go ahead.
oh no, sorry. And then I just think the overall kind of problem that this leads to, that we've been, the theme has been woven about today, is just it really diminishes your defensibility when you go and you try to talk about your internal process for preservation, your internal process for collection. If these legacy data sources, since they all have to be treated a little bit differently, it's difficult to develop and execute standardized processes, which will, increase your defensibility exponentially.
Yeah, oh, I can imagine. And of course, for a company like you mentioned, for a company like Walgreens, when you have, you have prescription data and a lot of basically a lot of health related data, that makes the risk even greater. And I think we're up to, I think last time I counted, I think we're up to 19 states, I think right now that have passed data privacy laws. So yeah, it's more challenging than ever because each one's just a little bit different. So we talked a little bit about what rot data is, Adam, but what's Sun data and why is that important to an organization?
Yeah, so in the keeping of traditional acronyms here, SUN data is what we would consider sensitive, useful, and necessary data. So that's data that you need to operate your business or that you're required by regulation to keep or to catalog. Um, and when we say we really want to separate the sun from the rot, when you just look at a data lake or other large data repository. And I think what we find is pretty consistently the majority of the data is probably at some phase of rot. It may not necessarily be trivial, but we have a lot of redundant. A lot of people save the same thing different places, and so you have 50,000 copies of the same or very similar documents. Um, and that Sun data, to get that Sun to shine through, as we in the Legal Data Intelligence Initiative say, is critical because that data allows you to make data-driven decisions. It allows you to properly conduct discovery, and if you do a good job of keeping that Sun data, available to you, preserved when it has to be, and do a good job of eliminating rot data, you're setting yourself up for success for both legal hold and eDiscovery eventually when you have to go and review that data. It becomes much easier to catalog, review, and deal with data that's organized properly, that's necessary to the organization, that's useful for your litigation or your regulatory matter. And so that's why we want to make sure we hang on to the Sun data while we get rid of all that rot.
Yeah, makes sense. So probably we should have made it that the last bullet point on this slide, but um, but well, as we kind of move down the list here, the third bullet point talks about legal traditionally bearing the burden regarding these data challenges. So why is that a bad thing, especially given that legal is typically the department best positioned to focus on risk?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think the thing that comes to the top of my mind is, look, it's a misalignment of responsibilities. Legal is excellent at identifying risk, and understanding what may be risky to the organization. Um, but the department business units creating that data, they are much better positioned to manage and dispose of that data properly. Just to draw from real world examples, I know that keeping protected health information or PHI data, very, very risky. It's highly regulated. It's something that, in a data breach situation is just not data you want out there in the wild. Um, but I could not go to like our drug reimbursement team and say, okay, I'm going to analyze your data and decide what we need to keep and what we don't. I have no idea, from a business perspective, what data in that pool is Sun and what's rot. So I think that's at the core of the issue. It's just legal, again, excellent at identifying risk, not so great at understanding all of the underlying data. Um, the other thing I think is legal is typically reactive. We're not necessarily proactive all the time. We try to be as proactive as possible, but you get served that 1,500-page complaint. It's a reactive process. You have to figure out, okay, what's out here? What's our exposure? What's the risk? We need to dig into this and understand. Same thing when you get a regulatory request from any of the federal or state agencies. It's a reactive process. And so because we're not involved until there's an issue, it's difficult to kind of place that burden of managing the entire data problem on legal, because by the time it gets to us, there's already trouble. And it's quite honestly, once it gets to us, it's too late to do anything about that trouble because we're now under the legal obligation to preserve all the data, whether it's rot or sun. We're going to have to go through it and catalog it eventually.
Sure, that makes sense. So obviously, the whole organization has to work together, and those last two bullet points really kind of talk to that. So, could you discuss some ways in which organizations can achieve transparency and cross-functional collaboration, and how they manage their data environment and reduce legacy data and rot?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the most important factor in my mind is breaking down institutional silos. And now we're not talking about data silos, but organizational silos. So we have just in our environment, we have cross-functional governance committees where people from legal and the business and IT and other interested parties will sit down and talk about how do we deal with legacy data? What can we do to reduce the rot? And it's incredibly useful to really have that multidisciplinary team get together and just talk and communicate. It's a situation where legal, like we mentioned, isn't the best to execute on the data hygiene because we may not understand the challenges. But if you go to the business and really help them understand the risk and help them understand how, a day of preventative maintenance now will save the company potentially millions of dollars or a lot of effort down the road. I think most people in the business and IT and these other departments are willing to help. But legal, what we can do to affect that change is really help break down those silos and initiate that collaboration. And I think, the other part is, look, without metrics and reporting, it's impossible to know what's out there. So one of the things we like to do is get together with our IT department and say, all right, where are systems where there's just a bunch of garbage, and then, let's involve the business and see how we can get that cleaned up. And it's really just about involving the business in discussions about the life cycle, the data life cycle process. If you are in a fortunate situation where you've got a bunch of data in a cloud-based solution that you can apply retention labels to, and the retention labels will go out and do their thing automatically. Hey, that's great. You're probably ahead of the curve. But going out and involving the business in those data lifecycle challenges is a great way to do it. It's a great way to start the conversation and start getting that understanding outside of legal. And really, that, in my mind, just fosters this culture of transparency throughout the organization. People can often get cagey or defensive about their practices, especially if they think, "Oh my gosh, here comes legal, and they're gonna, they're gonna pick me apart, and it's gonna be this negative experience." And it just doesn't need to be that way. Just say, "Look, we want to." As legal, when I go talk to business units, I say, "Hey, look, I want to be as transparent as possible." Because if we all understand and we're all on the same page, that makes everyone's job as we move through this litigation easier. There's, we can't control what regulatory requests we get. We can't control the litigation that we get involved with, on the defense side of the V. So the best we can do is just say, hey, look, we're going to operate transparently, break down these silos, make sure everyone has an understanding of what's going on so that we can move forward in the most efficient way.
Yeah. Yeah, makes perfect sense. If you're starting to do all that, once you've got that filing, that regulatory filing or that case filing, you're already behind. So that's certainly true. Here's a pyramid, which looks somewhat like the game show, the $10,000 pyramid, which I think I'm dating myself actually, because I think they're up to like 100,000 now on the show. But could you walk us through this diagram and discuss the Legal Data Intelligence Initiative and its role in promoting how to achieve greater value within your organization's data?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Legal Data Intelligence Initiative was started about 3 years ago when a group of about 20 of us got together and said, hey, we all face common challenges dealing with data in the context of legal, compliance, privacy, information security, just all these tasks where legal is somehow involved. And so we got together and over 2 years kind of put together, okay, how do we do this? How do we break down silos? How do we enable people to better deal with these challenges? And what we came up with was the legal data intelligence model. And so if you look at the bottom, you have mostly rot data at the bottom of the pyramid, right? The greatest volume of data you have is probably rot. And if anyone on the webinar, thinks we are all sun data and we have very little rot, email me afterwards because I'd love to know your system. I find it just, as much as we try, the bottom of the pyramid is where we usually start, right? And so how do we climb up that pyramid and get to the point where we can see the sun, where we can say, look, now I've filtered out the rot. We're now looking at the sun data. The majority of what we're looking at is that sensitive, useful, or necessary data. And there's really 3 key phases to any data challenge. We like to call them the 3 I's in legal data intelligence, and that's initiate, investigate, and implement. So if you look, initiation is that first step. Why are you looking at the data? What are you hoping to accomplish? It's essentially problem definition. I've got all this data. What do I need to do with it? And a lot of times it could be respond to a regulatory request or produce data in litigation, whatever it is. That's what starts the process of looking at the data. When you go up the pyramid, then in the investigating phase, you're executing on your plan. You're doing something. In eDiscovery, that could be collection and review. In a privacy, investigation, that could also be looking at that data to see what data is there that needs to be, removed from a CCPA request or a DSAR or any of those. So you're doing something in that investigate phase. And then at the implement phase, all the way at the top, that's where you've got the data you need, and now you need to act on it. You need to do something. You're going to either make that production or respond to that regulatory request, or even in a very simple model, delete the rot, purge the rot. Now that you've identified and you separated the rot from the sun, even if it's a little bit, you're still taking those baby steps forward. So, legal data intelligence was not meant to, supplant the Clock Core 12 or the EDRM or any of these other fine models that we have out there. Legal data intelligence is really just, if you've never faced a particular niche data challenge before, this will give you a place to start. And at least it gives you a roadmap to understand, hey, I'm not out here, swimming in the middle of the ocean with no life jacket. Somebody else somewhere has dealt with this before. So how can I get a step up? How can I get that life raft so at least I have a place to start? For anyone that's interested, there's a link here. Go out to our website. There's case studies, there's blog posts, there's all sorts of resources that for any data challenges you find, you may find some solutions there for you.
Yeah, and you've identified a number, or LDI's identified a number of specific legal use cases that you can really apply the principles to. So it's not just kind of in a vacuum, but you were talking about real use cases that legal professionals are dealing with. So definitely notable there. So obviously you can't get through a webinar with talking about AI. So so Adam, from your standpoint, what role does AI play in helping to achieve an organization's data goals, especially when it comes to eDiscovery and compliance?
Yeah, it's AI is that beautiful double-edged sword when it comes to data challenges, right? On the one hand, you have this tool that you can point at some sort of legacy data source, have the generative AI product, read it, understand it, summarize you, tell you what it is, and then you can make decisions on it. On the other hand, you have now however many employees you have in your organization that you've given access to generative AI tools to generating data by the bucket load. And the data generation is just an alarming exponential curve. It's, the line is almost straight up and down. And so when you talk about AI as a solution, AI is also part of the issue. But when you look at it from kind of the 30,000 point view, it's not going to be humanly possible to keep up with the data explosion, which is my trademarked word for what's happening to us, without the use of some of this advanced technology. So AI really plays a role, especially in eDiscovery and compliance in understanding what you have and empowering decision makers to make better, more informed, data-driven decisions rather than, hey, we have a bunch of these old SharePoint sites and we're going to flip a coin and just hope we don't need that data, because no one has the time to go through 500 gigabytes of random Word documents. That's a task easily handled by NLP models with AI that you just would take people much too long to be useful.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we took this long to mention AI. I guess we took this long to mention people, process, technology, because it all works together, for sure. Speaking of dated references, this meme from the 60s Batman, classic 60s Batman TV show, which I loved as a kid, reminds us that this is a two-part webinar, and we're just talking about the first part here, defensible disposition and remediation of legacy data. As the phrase garbage in, garbage out demonstrates, the quality of data going into an AI model is critical to ensuring the quality of the output these models generate. So 4 weeks from today, and again, for those who had some challenges with the slides, we will make sure we get these slides to you, which will have this link there. On June 12th at 1 p.m. Eastern will be part 2, where we're going to discuss how to leverage these AI models and useful Sun data, including the role data plays in AI development, how to manage risks in AI projects, some of the real-world applications for AI for legal professionals, ethical and regulatory considerations of AI-driven data analysis, what role legal and governance teams play on an ongoing basis in monitoring AI. We'll also revisit today's case study to identify lessons that we can apply that your organization should start doing now, and future-proofing your data governance strategies to facilitate the application of AI into your organization. So make a note of that, and once you get the slides, you can click on the link and hopefully attend part 2 of our webinar. So that takes us to the question slide, and we do have a couple of questions here, so let me get to those. The first question, back to the case study we're talking about, was there any scope creep that was faced during the legacy email data restoration and remediation project? Brenda and John, any comments about that?
The answer is yes. So as we talked about, legal holds are a living thing, right? So when we initially started the project, we obviously had kind of an order on jurisdictions that needed to be completed and when, based on the migration calendar. But legal holds come up and priorities change. So we did have to do some kind of pivoting on some jurisdictions and move one ahead of another, or get a certain custodian's data collected faster than others based on updates to legal holds or new holds that came in.
Yeah, that makes sense. So a large project like that, it's not surprising there'd be some.
Yeah, I mean, when you're talking about over a year, new legal holds come in every single week, and when you're talking about a global company, you're not talking 1 or 2 custodians at times. You're talking hundreds of custodians sometimes for a matter. So we had to pivot a couple of times. Yeah.
Like a Grand Central Station of legal holds, I would imagine.
Exactly.
So another question is, has any company been fined from a regulatory perspective for rot data? I don't know the answer to that. Do any of you have any idea if that's ever been a case that you know of where a company's been fined for just having rot data? It seems like it would be more about what happens with the data than having been fined for having the data. Are any of you aware of anything? Yeah.
I think the definition of rot means that it can't be fined for rot data, I think.
Well, yeah, right. That's true. Yeah, good point. It's not necessarily just being fined for having it, but it can typically, and I just covered a eDiscovery case law ruling today that involves sanctions for spoliation of video data. Obviously, when you have so much data and you lose control, what sort of what's the challenges that come from getting to that Sun data or that write data and preserving observing it is what really then leads to fines or sanctions in cases or what have you. Another question that just came in, I know we're almost here at time. As AI increases, what new legal challenges come from interbot communication? That's an interesting one. Anybody have any thoughts on that one?
I mean, yeah, lots of challenges, right? And it's the standard challenge we normally talk about with AI, and I'll try and be brief because we're out of time, but AI is essentially a black box. And so understanding what output you're getting via the input is very difficult to say how, what happened in the middle of that. And the other thing that we're still trying to figure out, of course, in the legal industry are, if you're in the legal department and you're using AI, are your prompts protected by lawyer, client communications or attorney work product? Is the because you're putting this out into the model. And the other thing is, we've seen, not yet in the US, but I think it's interesting. We saw a case in Canada where a AI-powered chatbot agreed to refund a customer like an obscene amount of money, and the company was like, "Yeah, no, we're not doing that." And the Canadian court said, "Hey, your bot, through the legal concept of agency, is an agent of your company, so you're going to have to make good on what your AI told this customer it was going to do for them." So it opens up the proverbial Pandora's box of challenges, and I'm not sure we know all of them yet. I think we're still trying to figure that out as the technology moves forward.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I remember that case and covered it a while back. And I'll also refer to something Adam mentioned about, we talk about, we're always having newer data sources we're having to deal with from a discovery and client standpoint. Consider generative AI generated data as the next big data source that I think we're all going to have to get our arms around, and, a variety of questions about, how we manage that data, how we collect that data. Are there work product considerations with that data? All those types of issues have to be considered. So definitely, I think, going to be some interesting aspects of things to consider. So we are past time. I don't see any more questions. So I want to thank our panelists, Brendan, John, and Adam, for their great insights today, and want to thank you all for attending today's webinar on the ACEDS webinar channel and for the terrific questions. Please visit aceds.org for a complete list of upcoming webinars, including part 2 of our webinar series on June 12th. And also, please consider following, shameless plug warning, and subscribing to eDiscovery Today at eDiscoverytoday.com for daily eDiscovery news and updates. And as Mike always says, have a great day, everyone, and be kind to one another. Goodbye. And thanks, guys.
Take care.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Bye.